It was a late December morning when Dorothy opened her front door, only to be greeted by the sharp sting of the cold. The icy wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the unmistakable silence of winter, deep, heavy, and still. But it wasn't just the cold that caught her attention. On the porch, huddled together for warmth, were two trembling dogs, both small, but their fur matted with frost, their faces gaunt from hunger, their eyes wide with the desperate hope of survival. Dorothy hesitated for only a moment. The sight of them, their vulnerability, struck her to her core. Her heart sank with recognition these dogs were barely alive. But something in their eyes, something raw and pleading, pulled at her in a way she couldn't ignore. She reached down, and her weathered hands, trembling with age, gently scooped one of them into her arms, feeling the cold of its body seep into her skin. The second dog, a more hesitant, whimpered softly, but as soon as Dorothy turned toward the door, it followed, inching closer, trusting her without hesitation. She didn't know why they had come to her doorstep, why they had appeared in such dire need. But in that moment, she understood what she had to do. The warmth of her small cottage felt like the first breath of life to these animals. She would care for them, protect them, and make sure they saw the next day. The house was quiet as she settled them by the fire, the scent of burning wood mingling with the sharp tang of wet fur. The warmth was slowly starting to seep into their bodies, and she watched them relax, their eyes closing in relief. Dorothy sat down on her old armchair, looking out the window as the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world outside. The dogs had come for warmth, for care, and in that moment, she couldn't help but feel the quiet certainty that she had made the right choice. But what she didn't know, as she sat there watching them sleep, was that this small, quiet act of kindness was going to set off a chain of events that would change everything. The next morning, a whole police squad would be standing at her door, and Dorothy's life, for better or worse, would never be the same again. The night was still, save for the soft howl of the wind that cut through the trees outside Dorothy's cottage. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow on the room. Dorothy had just settled into her armchair with a cup of tea when a sound at the door caught her attention. A soft whimper, barely audible over the wind. She rose slowly, her joints protesting, and opened the door. There, on the porch, were two dogs, their fur matted with snow, their bodies trembling with the cold. The sight took her breath away. She hesitated, then stepped forward, feeling the icy chill of their bodies as she gently lifted them into her arms. They were small, vulnerable, but alive, barely. She carried them inside, where the warmth of the fire could reach them, where they could feel safe. As she watched them settle by the hearth, their bodies slowly warming, Dorothy couldn't help but wonder how they had ended up here, at her doorstep, on a night so bitterly cold. The snow outside continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. It felt like the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand, but would soon be forced to face. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, illuminating the quiet warmth of Dorothy's cottage. She had been awake for hours, listening to the soft breathing of the dogs by the fire. Ruby and Max were beginning to recover, their bodies no longer trembling from the cold, their eyes slowly losing their fear. Dorothy had prepared breakfast for herself, though she barely ate, her mind preoccupied with the events of the night before. She had made a decision to care for these animals, but what did it mean? Was it enough to simply offer shelter and food? Or was there something more at play? The knock at the door was sudden, forceful, startling Dorothy out of her reverie. She set her teacup down with trembling hands and walked slowly to the door, wondering who would be calling at this hour. When she opened it, she was met with a sight that made her heart leap in her chest. 3 police officers, their expressions stern, their uniforms crisp against the dull backdrop of the snow. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions about 2 dogs that were recently brought into your care," the officer in the lead said, his voice clipped, professional. Dorothy blinked, confused. I don't understand. What do you mean?" The officer's face softened, though there was no warmth in his eyes. "These dogs, Ma'am, they were part of an ongoing investigation. They were abandoned, left to freeze." He paused, looking behind her into the cottage. We need to talk to you about where they came from, who brought them here." Her heart raced as she tried to process the words. Abandoned. These two sweet souls had been left to die. She glanced back at the dogs who were now lying in front of the fire, relaxed and warm. They were safe here. But Dorothy could feel the weight of what she had unknowingly become entangled in. She wasn't prepared for this. She didn't know anything about these dogs beyond their silent plea for help, but she knew one thing: they had found her for a reason. The officer's gaze grew sharper as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room for any evidence, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. "Ma'am, these dogs are part of a larger case involving criminal activity. We need to know how you came into possession of them." Dorothy's voice trembled. I found them outside my door last night, abandoned in the cold. I brought them inside to keep them safe. They've been through so much already." The officer nodded, but his eyes never softened. "We're going to need to take them into custody for further investigation." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Dorothy's mind whirled, her heart sinking into her chest. How could she let them take the dogs? After everything they had been through together. But there was something else, something darker lurking beneath the surface of the officer's words. He didn't just want to talk. He wanted the dogs, and something told Dorothy that he wasn't the only one who would be showing up at her door. Days passed, but the anxiety from the police visit remained, like a dark cloud hanging over the cottage. Dorothy went about her daily routine, caring for Ruby and Max, keeping them close, trying to shield them from the growing tension outside. They had become more than just two frightened, abandoned animals. They were her companions now, her family, even if the world didn't understand why. Max, with his deep brown eyes, was beginning to trust her fully. His large frame would curl up next to her at night, his body radiating warmth, his presence a silent promise that they were in this together. Ruby, the more skittish of the two, was still hesitant, but she had started to seek comfort in Dorothy's arms, allowing her to stroke her fur without flinching. But every time Dorothy looked out the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The police had left, but the threat of something more ominous lingered. The phone calls had started to come in too. People from the local animal shelter, others who claimed to be familiar with the dog's background, warning her that she could be in danger. Dorothy didn't know who to trust. There were too many questions, too many layers to the story that she hadn't even begun to understand. One afternoon, as she was preparing dinner, there was another knock at the door. This time, when she opened it, she found no police officers, but a man. His face was unfamiliar, though his eyes held a hard, calculating look. He wore a heavy coat, his breath visible in the cold air. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice low. "You have the dogs?" Dorothy didn't answer at first, but she could feel her pulse quicken, her body instinctively stepping back into the cottage. The man's eyes flicked to the window, scanning for any sign of movement. I don't know who you are, but those dogs are mine now," Dorothy said, her voice shaking but firm. "They were left on my doorstep. They're safe here." The man stepped forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "You're in the middle of something far bigger than you think. I'm trying to help you, but you need to understand that you can't keep them here. Not for long." Dorothy's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped back, her hand instinctively reaching for the door to close it. "You need to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But as the man turned and walked away, she knew that the quiet peace of her home was slipping away. It was later that night when the storm finally came, not just in the form of the fierce winds and thick snowfall that rattled the cottage windows, but the storm of fear and uncertainty that Dorothy had been dreading. She was sitting in the living room with Ruby and Max, their bodies close, when a sound from outside caught her attention. The dogs' ears perked up, and they began to growl softly, their bodies tense. Dorothy's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the unease in the air. Something was coming. She stood, her body stiff with anxiety, and moved to the window. Her breath fogged the glass as she peered out into the swirling snow. In the distance, she saw the outline of a car, a dark silhouette against the pale backdrop of the storm. The headlights flashed once, then twice. Dorothy's pulse quickened. She knew who it was. The men had come. Before she could react, there was a sharp knock on the door. She didn't hesitate. Her hand gripped the handle, but a wave of fear washed over her. What was she supposed to do? She couldn't let them take Ruby and Max. Not after everything they had been through. The knock came again, louder this time. With trembling hands, Dorothy opened the door, and there they stood. 4 men, their faces obscured by hoods and scarves, their eyes cold. "Where are the dogs?" One of them demanded, his voice rough, like the gravel roads that led to nowhere. Dorothy's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped back, closing the door behind her. "You need to leave," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. But they didn't leave. One of the men reached for the door, and in that moment everything changed. Ruby and Max barked frantically, sensing the danger. The men's eyes flashed with impatience, and they stepped forward, trying to push the door open. That's when Dorothy heard the sirens. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the snow-covered ground as the police car pulled up to the cottage. The officers rushed out, moving swiftly toward the door. The men in front of her paused, momentarily stunned, before they turned and ran, disappearing into the dark night. Dorothy's breath came in shallow gasps as she watched the police officers surround her home. The officer who had visited earlier stepped forward, his expression a mix of concern and relief. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Dorothy nodded, her body still shaking, her heart still racing. The storm was over. The danger had passed. But as she looked down at Ruby and Max, now safe in her arms, she knew that the real battle wasn't over yet. They had all survived. And now, it was time for them to heal together. The days following the police arrival felt like an endless blur. Despite the threat of danger that had loomed over Dorothy's small cottage, a sense of peace had settled within her. Ruby and Max had become part of her life in a way she couldn't have predicted. They were no longer just dogs, no longer just the victims of a cruel world. They had become her family, the ones who kept her company, the ones who protected her when everything else felt fragile. The storm outside had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a thick layer of snow, the landscape now peaceful still. Inside, the warmth of the cottage seemed to create a small pocket of calm in an otherwise chaotic world. The days had grown shorter, the nights colder, but Dorothy found herself waking each morning to the soft sound of Ruby and Max stretching and yawning beside her bed. Max, the larger dog, had become more playful in the safety of their home. His tail wagged vigorously as he chased after a ball Dorothy tossed across the room, his large frame bounding with youthful energy. Ruby, always the more cautious of the two, had begun to show signs of recovery. The nervous glances had softened, and though she still wasn't quick to trust strangers, Dorothy could see the spark of curiosity in her eyes. Every day brought a new step forward, and Dorothy reveled in their growth. But with this new calm came the constant tension that still hung in the air. The police had left, but the dark men who had visited her door remained a threat. She knew it was only a matter of time before they would return to try and reclaim what they believed was theirs. The peace inside the cottage, the newfound sense of security, felt fragile, like a thin sheet of glass about to shatter at the slightest touch. One evening, as the sun set early behind the hills, Dorothy sat at her small kitchen table, staring out the window at the swirling snowflakes outside. Max was curled up at her feet, his head resting on her lap, while Ruby lay near the fire, her eyes half closed in contentment. Dorothy stroked Max's fur absent-mindedly, her mind racing. What if they came back? What if this peaceful life, this fragile bond she had built, was about to be torn apart? But as she sat there, she realized that no matter what came next, she had already made the decision. These dogs were hers now. She had given them her love, and in return, they had given her something she hadn't realized she'd been missing: purpose. The thought of losing that, of losing them, was unbearable. The doorbell rang, pulling Dorothy from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat, a wave of unease washing over her as she rose to answer. Who could it be at this hour? She wasn't expecting anyone, and the ominous silence of the world outside added a layer of tension. The last time someone knocked at her door, it had changed everything. When she opened the door, her breath caught. Standing there in the cold, silhouetted against the darkening sky, was a figure she recognized. It was the police officer who had first come to her home. But this time, there was no stern expression, no urgency in his voice. He looked tired, his face weathered from long hours in the field. "Mom," he said softly, as if trying to gauge her reaction. "I'm sorry to disturb you again. We've got some news." Dorothy's stomach clenched. Was this the end of it? Was this the moment they would take Ruby and Max from her, and her life would go back to the quiet, lonely existence it had been before? She took a deep breath, steadying herself. No, she wouldn't let that happen. Not again. She stepped aside to let the officer in, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer's face softened, and he took a step forward. "I've been following the case," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the situation. "We've been gathering information on the group who abandoned these dogs. And well, I've got good news." Dorothy's pulse quickened. "Good news." The officer nodded. "They've been arrested. The organization is being dismantled. You don't need to worry anymore. The dogs are safe. And you? Well, you're safe." A sense of relief washed over Dorothy, the tightness in her chest finally loosening. She had been prepared for the worst, but this was a victory. Not just for Ruby and Max, but for her too. She had been part of something bigger than herself, something that had forced her to confront her fears, her loneliness, and her capacity to love. "Thank you," Dorothy whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't know what to do. But now I know they're safe." The officer smiled faintly, his expression softening. "You did the right thing. They're lucky they found you." As the officer left, Dorothy stood at the door, her eyes locked on the snow-covered ground. She looked back inside, where Ruby and Max were now playing together by the fire, their bodies healthy and strong. The peace she had longed for had finally settled into her heart. For the first time in a long while, Dorothy didn't feel like she was alone. Weeks passed, and life in the cottage continued to take on a new rhythm. The tension that had hung in the air slowly dissipated as Dorothy, Ruby, and Max found their footing in their new reality. The dogs, no longer the victims of cruel fate, had blossomed under Dorothy's care, their personalities emerging fully as their health improved. Max, once the large, reserved dog who had been hesitant to trust, now met every new day with a wagging tail and a bark of excitement. Ruby, though still a little cautious, had found comfort in the routines Dorothy had established for them. Her once fearful eyes were now filled with trust and affection, and she sought out Dorothy's presence at every turn. Dorothy had taken to walking them daily, through the forest paths that surrounded her home. The trees, now heavy with the weight of winter, stood silent and still as they passed, their snow-covered branches creating a canopy of white above. The world felt peaceful in those moments, as if time had slowed down, giving them the space to just be. But life wasn't always quiet. Some days the weight of the past would resurface. Memories of the men who had threatened her home, of the police officers who had intervened. But Dorothy never let that fear define her. The love she had for Ruby and Max was stronger than any external threat. It was a love that had been forged in the fires of uncertainty, and now nothing could take it from her. One afternoon, as the three of them walked through the snow, Ruby bounded ahead, her joyful bark breaking the silence of the forest. Dorothy smiled, watching her go, then turned to Max, who walked faithfully beside her. In that moment, she knew they were more than just survivors of a cruel fate. They were her companions, her family, and together, they had healed in ways she couldn't have imagined. As they walked back to the cottage, the snow continued to fall, soft and quiet, covering the world in a blanket of white. Dorothy felt a warmth in her heart, knowing that no matter what the future held, she had found a new beginning. And in that beginning, she and the dogs would face whatever came next. Together. Months passed, and Dorothy's life had transformed in ways she never expected. The days, though still quiet, now held a different kind of peace. Ruby and Max had become not just a part of her life, but the center of it. Their presence filled the cottage with warmth and love. They had moved beyond the trauma they'd endured, and so had she. The community had started to accept the dogs too. Neighbors who once viewed Dorothy with skepticism now waved at her on her walks, smiling at the dogs who had come to embody resilience. Ruby and Max had become symbols of survival, not just for themselves but for everyone around them. One afternoon, as Dorothy sat on her porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Max lay at her feet, his head resting on her knee. Ruby, ever the curious one, trotted to and fro in the yard. The world seemed at peace. The snow, now beginning to melt, left behind patches of grass that swayed gently in the wind. Dorothy looked at her two dogs, her heart swelling with gratitude. They had all come so far, from the darkness of that first cold night to this tranquil moment. Life, once filled with isolation and fear, had opened up to something more. The dogs had saved her as much as she had saved them, and now they had become a family. A reminder that love, even in the most unexpected places, could heal the deepest wounds. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Dorothy smiled, feeling the warmth of the moment wash over her. Together, she thought, we've found our way home. And for the first time in a long time, Dorothy knew peace. As the first signs of spring began to stretch across the horizon, Dorothy's life settled into a gentle rhythm that felt both familiar and completely new. The days, which had once felt like an endless stretch of cold and silence, were now filled with soft light and the promise of warmer days. The snow was melting, leaving behind the brown earth, which had been hidden for months. And though it was still early in the season, Dorothy felt a quiet optimism settle within her, an optimism she hadn't known in years. Ruby and Max had both transformed, not just physically, but emotionally. The timid and fearful dogs that had first stepped into her life now walked beside her with their heads held high. Max, once a shadow of uncertainty, had turned into a protective, devoted companion. His large frame seemed to radiate confidence now, and he would stand guard as she tended to the garden or worked inside the house. Ruby, with her softer disposition, had become more affectionate, her trust in Dorothy unwavering. She would follow her everywhere, curling up at her feet when Dorothy sat down for her tea, and the joy in her eyes was evident every time they went on their walks together. The community had started to change too. Dorothy had begun to step out of the shadows of her solitary existence and engage with her neighbors. She'd become a more active part of her small town, not just as the quiet woman who lived at the edge of the forest, but as the one who had opened her heart to these two dogs, and, in the process, had opened herself up to the world. She had even begun helping with the local shelter, offering advice and fostering other animals that needed temporary care. One Saturday afternoon, as Dorothy tended to the garden, she found herself lost in the warmth of the sun, the scent of fresh earth, and the sound of Ruby and Max playing together in the yard. The days felt long, but in the best possible way, full of possibility, full of small joys that she had once overlooked. Dorothy's mind drifted back to the days when her cottage had been just a place to live, a refuge from the world. She had never imagined it could become something so full of life. It was more than just a house now, it was a home, a place where healing, love, and second chances grew. And just as Dorothy was marveling at the change, she heard the familiar sound of a knock at the door. Her heart skipped, a moment of anxiety rising in her chest as she turned toward the entrance. After everything that had happened, every complication and struggle, it felt as though a knock at the door might always carry some weight of fear or uncertainty. But when she opened it, she was greeted by a familiar face, the officer who had first arrived at her home. His expression was warm, no longer hard or urgent, but softened with time and experience. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his tone lighter than it had been that first day. "No, not at all," Dorothy replied, her voice steady as she stepped aside to let him in. "What brings you here today?" The officer smiled, glancing at Ruby and Max as they trotted over to greet him. "I wanted to check in on you on them. I just came from the station, and we've received some good news. The case is officially closed. The people responsible for what happened to Ruby and Max, well, they won't be a problem anymore." Dorothy's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, it felt as if the weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had lifted, and a deep exhale escaped her. That's wonderful," she whispered, her heart swelling with relief. "I'm so glad." The officer nodded, but his eyes softened as he looked at the dogs. "I never thought I'd see a pair of dogs who'd been through so much turnout like this. You've done something incredible here." "It's rare, Mom, but sometimes things work out the way they're meant to." Dorothy smiled, looking down at Ruby and Max, their tails wagging as they circled her. "I didn't do anything special," she said quietly. I just gave them what they needed. I think they gave me the same." The officer's gaze lingered on them, and then he chuckled. "Well, in that case, you've both saved each other." Dorothy nodded, her eyes filled with the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had made the right choice, even when the path wasn't clear. She had followed her heart, and in doing so, she had given these dogs a second chance at life. But she, too, had found something she hadn't even realized she'd been missing. A chance at a life that was full of meaning, connection, and warmth. As the days turned into weeks, Dorothy's life continued to flourish in ways she could never have expected. The seasons began to shift, with spring fully blossoming into summer. The air was warm now, and Dorothy's garden bloomed with life, much like the rest of her world. Max and Ruby, no longer the fragile creatures that had stumbled onto her doorstep, were thriving. They spent their days chasing each other through the fields that surrounded the cottage, their playful barks carrying on the wind. The bond between them and Dorothy was undeniable, and she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for every single moment she had with them. In the town, Dorothy had become known as the woman who had given these dogs a second chance at life, and in turn, she had begun to take part in more community activities. She was a constant presence at the local shelter, helping other animals find their forever homes, and her once quiet life had evolved into one filled with connection and purpose. But it wasn't just the dogs or the people who had changed. It was Dorothy herself. She had learned to trust again, to open herself to love, and to the uncertainty that life sometimes presented. She had been given a second chance, just like Ruby and Max, and now she found herself looking forward to the future with hope in her heart. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Dorothy sat on the porch, watching Ruby and Max play in the yard. She could feel the warmth of the evening air on her skin, and the peaceful sound of nature filled her ears. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking it all in, the serenity, the love, the second chance. When she opened her eyes, she saw Max standing by her side, looking up at her with his deep brown eyes, his tail wagging softly. Ruby trotted over next, her steps light and joyful. And in that moment, Dorothy knew that no matter what the future held, she would never be alone again. Because they were her family now, Ruby, Max, and herself, and together, they had faced the storm and come out on the other side. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Dorothy sat back in her chair, feeling the peace of the moment settle deep within her. She had been given the gift of healing, of love, and of family, and she was finally home. In the end, Dorothy's journey wasn't just about saving 2 dogs. It was about finding herself. Through the trials, the uncertainty, and the darkness that had initially surrounded her, she had found the light. Ruby and Max had come to her as lost souls, but together, they had built a life filled with love and hope. Their pasts were behind them, but their future was one of endless possibilities. And in that quiet, peaceful cottage surrounded by fields and forests, Dorothy found the home she had always longed for, not just for herself, but for the animals who had saved her in ways she never could have imagined. As summer embraced the small cottage, Dorothy found herself standing at the threshold of something she had never expected: peace. The air was warm, rich with the scent of blooming flowers, and the world outside her door hummed with life. Ruby and Max, now thriving under her care, ran circles in the yard, their joy a quiet testimony to the healing they had all undergone. They weren't the scared, abandoned souls they once were. They were strong, confident, and full of life, and so was Dorothy. Looking out over the meadow, Dorothy let out a slow breath, letting the sounds of the day wash over her. She had come so far since that cold night when the dogs had appeared at her door. She hadn't known what would come of their chance encounter. What she had started with a simple act of kindness had turned into something transformative. But she had learned something essential: love and care were not just for animals. They were a way of life that she had forgotten about, but had now rediscovered. Max padded over to her, his large frame now unburdened by fear, his tail wagging with the same carefree energy that Ruby carried. The two dogs had become her family, and in their silent, steadfast way, they had shown her the true meaning of connection. She had found herself becoming more involved in the community, offering help where she could, whether it was volunteering at the shelter or simply lending an ear to a neighbor in need. What had started as a solitary life now held a deep sense of belonging. Dorothy had become someone she could be proud of, not just because of what she had given to the dogs, but because of what they had given her in return. She had been reminded that life's greatest gifts come from opening your heart, taking the leap even when the path is unclear, even when the outcome is uncertain. It had been that very uncertainty that had brought Ruby and Max into her life, and in turn, it had shown her the beauty of embracing the unknown. As the days passed, she felt more secure in the knowledge that she was no longer alone. With Ruby and Max by her side, she had built a life full of purpose. The struggles of the past, the threats that had once loomed over them, no longer held the same power. There would always be challenges ahead, but Dorothy now had the strength to face them, surrounded by the love of her two loyal companions. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Dorothy sat on the porch, her gaze lingering on the horizon. She could feel the warmth of the day still lingering in the air, a reminder of how far they had come. Ruby and Max lay beside her, their heads resting peacefully at her feet. It was a simple moment, no words needed, but it held everything. In that stillness, Dorothy realized that she had found her place in the world. And in that place, she was home. Together they had endured. Together they had healed. And in the comfort of one another they would continue to grow, with love as their guiding force. The future, though unknown, was something they would face side by side, ready for whatever it brought. They were a family now. And nothing, not even the past, could change that.